Well, hello again, everyone. For the benefit of anyone joining us on live streaming or the recording, this event is being live streamed. Welcome to Blackwood Undying Church and this, our first journeying event for 2022. Blackwood has been running these journeying events by different names. Originally it was called the Occasional Series for a number of years now. And journeying is a way of looking at aspects of spirituality in a much broader way than typically conceived within churches. And they've been very popular as we've engaged in things such as Indigenous spirituality, spirituality of sustainability, science and wonder. This year we have some very interesting topics. If you haven't already, please pick up one of the journeying brochures before you leave. The events we have this year, as well as tonight's, which I'll get to in a moment, is Making Space by Mandy, Harvey, a contemplative approach. Noticing the Small Things by Chelsea Size, a narrative therapist. Through the Contemplative Way by Gary Stuckey. And Just Earth, where Brian Polkinghorne and David Shepherd from the Environmental Action Group will be looking at how can we indeed have a just earth. Another event I do wish to bring to your attention, if you are not aware already, is on the 2nd of April. We have here at Blackwood Undying Church, 5 o'clock, Responding to Ukraine, which is an event that I think may fill a community need. We are making it open to the general public. It is not a religious event. It is open to people of all faiths and none to come and express concern, to learn something about the conflict and talk about things that can be done in a practical way to help. But tonight we are absolutely delighted in this first journeying series for the year to welcome Professor Ian Olver and his wife Jenny. I had heard Ian's name a number of times in different contexts, but associated with cancer research and cancer treatment. But then I encountered Ian at an event at Sunset Rock Uniting Church, and it was a dialogue he had with a Uniting Church minister about the intersection between faith and science. And I was really taken by the thoughtful, considered way that Ian responded to questions about this interface between science and faith. I was also amazed that amongst his many, many responsibilities and interests, he'd somehow managed to find time to run, I kid you not, a clinical trial assessing the effectiveness of intercessory prayer. A man of very amazing and diverse interests. Trained as a medical oncologist, Ian has worked in the field of cancer research and treatment for many years. In addition to his focus on cancer, he has made time to complete a PhD in bioethics. His current research interests are in psycho-oncology, supportive care in cancer, and bioethics. Ian's the author of over 330 journal articles and is a regular commentator on cancer issues in Australia and internationally, and is a recipient of the Order of Australia. Having heard many prestigious posts around the country, he's now Professorial Research Fellow, School of Psychology, University of Adelaide. Having worked for so long in the field of cancer research and treatment, I have no doubt that Ian has related to and journeyed with so many people who had been given the worst of news and coping with immense difficulty. How does one maintain hope in the face of incredibly difficult circumstances? We hope to hear tonight, Ian, of those sources of hope in your talk, Undying Hope. Please join me in welcoming Professor Ian Olver.
Well, thank you very much, and it's great to be here. When I'm giving these sort of talks, I like it to be a dialogue, so I don't wait for the end for a question. You might forget it, so just interrupt me in the middle as we go, and we'll have a chat about what you want to chat about instead of what I've prepared. So we'll start and see how that goes. So as we enter the third year of a pandemic, life continues to be challenging for many, not just in either dealing with COVID or avoiding COVID, but or the disruptions to their lives, either their work life or their social activities and so on. But we're not able easily to plan ahead for the things that we would look forward to. Travel, going to meet relatives in distant places and so on. And so that seems to have robbed us of something. And I'm hearing a lot of people who have almost an existential tiredness at this stage. I'm just exhausted. Well, why are they exhausted? Because they don't have this sort of stimulus of being able to plan ahead for something that they can look forward to and hope will give them a better bit of excitement than their current life is allowing under COVID. And of course there's the hope, and I think it is a realistic hope this year, that COVID will gradually transform to an endemic form and we'll learn to live with it without all the current restrictions, albeit probably still requiring vaccinations from time to time. So I want to explore things from the medical point of view of what do we mean by hope, what are sources of hope for people, what role does hope play during health and illness. And I have to say that, as I'll tell you in a minute, most of my initial engagement with hope came out of my clinical experience. How do we maintain hope when life gets tough? And what about the idea of false hope? People talk about false hope, but what does it mean? And where all this started for me was, why do people who are dying still talk so much about hope? And that was quite remarkable. Now, on your tables you had a few sayings or definitions, if you like, of hope, and I was pleased to say that none of them were the ones that I had here, so I'm not repeating any of that. So, because I did something very pragmatic, I looked up the Oxford Dictionary. I said, well, what's hope mean to the Oxford Dictionary? And it says it's a feeling of expectation and a desire for a particular thing to happen. That's pretty concise, I think. A couple of philosophers, Dualt and Martocchio, look at hope this way. Now, philosophers never use one word where 10 will do. So they've actually looked at this hope as this a multi-dimensional dynamic life force characterised by a confident yet uncertain expectation of achieving a good future which to the hoping person is realistically possible and personally significant. So what they've added to the Oxford Dictionary definition is a couple of interesting things. They've got this idea that it's uncertain, there's no doubt about that it's not a done deal that what you hope for is what you'll get. But the thing is, it's got to be realistically possible to have any currency with someone. I mean, you know, I might hope that I'll be a billionaire by tomorrow, but that's not going to happen. And so there's nothing that will help me by having a hope like that. That doesn't really fit into it again. And personally significant has to be something. If you hope for something and you don't really care very much whether it happens or not, you know, it's not a driving force in your life. It doesn't help you overcome, you know, the challenges of the present. So I think realistically possible and personally significant are important. In the medical context, all definitions encompass the concept of a desirable future event which when articulated in the present can have a positive influence on well-being, or at least a positive state. So you might be going through a tough time, but the hope for something in the future that's realistic may in fact give you a positivity because you're actually projecting into the future rather than solely existing in your current state. So how I got into it was some years ago, a PhD student of mine who tells me she's only 5 years from retirement now, so She was quite an elderly PhD. No, so she, a woman by the name of Jacqueline Elliott, we were studying actually something completely different. We were studying end-of-life decision-making, and we were studying it in the context of, how do you best talk to patients about, say, do not resuscitate orders when they get to a certain age in their illness, and you don't want, a crash team in a hospital to come along and try and start your heart. How do you have that discussion about people? And we were interviewing patients. Initially, they were patients who weren't dying, and then we moved the research to patients who were dying, and we asked them all sorts of questions. Who should make the decision about resuscitation? Who should be there when you make the decision, and so on. So we were asking questions so that we could inform the medical world about what the patient thought about this decision. When do you make that decision? Do you have the discussion early on before it's all that frightening, or do you have it when it applies? And what we found was that there's no one rule that could fit all, that you actually have to look at the patient in front of you and ascertain where they're up to and what they want to discuss at the time. But as we got into these interviews, Jacqueline came to me one day and said, Ian, I've been very interested in something in the interviews, that these patients who are dying probably within 2 or 3 months are using the word hope a lot. And in fact, they're using it not only in different senses, but even the same patient is using hope in different ways within the same couple of paragraphs. But the amazing thing is the word keeps coming up. Now, that triggered off something in both of us, and we said, all right, let's sort of suspend what you were doing and let's look into this question of hope for a moment. Universities don't like you doing that because they want your student to get through in 3 years. But if you're serious about what you do and you find something exciting, you let them go. And in fact, just between you and me, I gave her an extra year off to edit a book on hope, which has been quite useful and it has certainly helped her career. So what did we find? Well, we found that there was an enormous difference when the patient used hope as a noun versus hope as a verb. Why was that? Well, when you used hope as a noun, it was an entity that could be given to you or could be taken away from you. So that the doctor could come in and give you a challenging diagnosis like cancer, and perhaps if you asked for it in the course of things, could give you a poor prognosis. And it was like that was taking the hope away when they used it as a noun. I can't hope for anything now that I've got this diagnosis. But in fact, we discovered that was a fairly weak form of when they used hope. What was the far stronger form was when they used it as a verb. And what they were saying is, we are hoping for something. Now, interestingly enough, these patients were not always or very infrequently hoping for the miraculous cure. And that possibly comes into the realistically possible idea. It doesn't preclude that things unexpected won't happen, but in the general course of things, they weren't hoping. They were hoping for lesser things. They were hoping for, that they didn't suffer too much, that they were comfortable. They were hoping for anniversary events, that they'd live long enough to see someone graduate, or to the next Christmas, or to a birthday, or that there was time for a relative to come overseas to visit or whatever. So they were realistic and personally significant things that they were hoping for. And when it was used as a verb, it was a very strong motivator for them. They were doing the hoping and they were expressing what they wanted to do. And in fact, so we actually, could put this into operation in several different things, and I'll talk about it. But I happened to be at the Cancer Council at the time, and we were thinking of sort of slogans, and we were thinking of saying something like, we sustain hope in terms of cancer because we provide all sorts of support and all the rest of it. And I went back there and said, no. We're going to change that, and we're going to change it to, with you we have hope, because it was about them hoping and the use of the verb, and it was a very strong motivating factor. And what's been found in studies that hope and optimism are negatively correlated with depression and anxiety. So your current state of anxiety or depression can be in fact lifted if you are able to sustain a hope and an optimism for something in the future. So this was going to be a very powerful thing to learn how to manage in patients because you could help them through their current situation. And interestingly enough though, what it also shows us is that communicating to people about their cancer or about the treatment or about their poor prognosis need not deprive patients of hope at all, because their source of hope may become quite different from the medical source of hope. And some people say, they ask questions about, why is it that this patient is so sort of joyful when I've just told them that, they've only got a few months to live or a few weeks to live? Well, their hope may be coming from a different source. Some people derive hope from their spiritual life, and that's an enormous source of hope. And so just for a doctor to frame it in terms of the medical outcomes was not the way the patient saw it at all. So they could be hopeful in the presence of a poor medical outcome. And that's really quite important, because a lot of people say, oh, we can't discuss this with them because we'll destroy their hope. Well, you won't, because they may in fact have quite different hopes that can be achieved within their current constraints. And I've had patients actually that have been much relieved when you've given them their diagnosis, because they knew something was wrong with them. And no one could tell them what it was. And once they knew what it was, they had something they could tackle and do something with. So the idea that just looking at one small aspect of hope, in this case the medical hope, and I've seen people, look, he's too cheerful, didn't he understand what you say? And shouldn't you pick him up and shake him and say, didn't you hear what I say? Well, you shouldn't, because they're looking at a different source of their hope, and their hope might be quite realistic. And so we've got to look at interventions that will play into that increased hope and help decrease their current psychological distress. And this is where it was important to do further research into this area. Now, the interesting thing about dying is that in philosophical terms, irrespective of how long it is, we all value the rest of our life equally. So someone who's 20, who might have 60 years to live, values that rest of their life the same as someone who's 90, who may only have 6 years to live. The rest of their life as an entity is something they highly value and they want to make the most of. So it's not the case that just because life may be short, you can't hope for things and you can't have a rich life in that time frame. Sometimes, of course, hope may... We've got to address the issue of whether hope is false or not, and that's what you often do. Well, maybe this person's got a totally unrealistic idea of what I've told them. If you say someone's got a 1% chance of getting better, everyone you tell that to is always the 1%. And which is fine. I mean, it's lovely when that's the case, but that may lead them sometimes to actually make bad decisions. So, for example, we may offer a trial to someone of a new drug with all sorts of toxicities, and they'll take it in order to promote their hope, if you like, and that would be a bad reason for taking a new drug. They may do it for altruistic reasons, they may do it because they hope it works, but they've got to be far more realistic than just saying, oh, well, I'm going to be the one or two that respond to this if that's what you're testing out. And sometimes you create hope in a person when you don't mean to. When we were doing this study, it was actually one of my patients, but he said to the interviewer, he said, when Dr. Olver at the end of the consultation says, "I'll see you next month," he said, "That's fine." He said, "If he ever doesn't say that, then I'll worry." Well, I was just telling him when to make his next appointment. I wasn't telling him he was going to survive to that time, but it's interesting how he wanted to make a routine statement into something that gave him the hope. And if I ever missed out doing it, which I don't think I ever did, if I ever missed out doing it, then he'd worry. So that's how things can happen. Now, what about false hope? Well, some people had suggested when this idea that if you gave someone a poor outcome, that was going to take away all their hope as a noun, and we debunked that, if you like. But so the next thing was, well, perhaps you shouldn't be quite as accurate as you could be and allow them, a chance to hope, and that would be giving a false hope. And sometimes when patients seem to be far too optimistic compared to what you've told them, as I've said, they may be drawing their hope from somewhere else. But also you can't label that false hope because you don't know whether it was false or not until it ultimately plays out. And we've all seen people whose disease behaves differently from what we expect. I mean, when we tell somebody their individual prognosis, we're not actually telling them their individual prognosis, we're telling them what the statistics of all the patients with their disease are likely to do. We don't actually know very accurately how closely it applies to them, whether at the good end of the spectrum or the bad. So false hope is not false till it's proven later on. So you can't label someone who he's got false hope or she's got false hope. But giving false hope, giving poor information would be a very paternalistic way of doing things because people can take on board what you tell them and they can start planning what to do. If you know you've got a limited life, part of your hope is to shrink. Instead of worrying about what's going to happen next year, you say, I'm well now, how do I get through? What can I do that's exciting today? What can I do that's exciting this week? So you have the opportunity to start reordering and replanning your life. And so you can keep hope up by just changing your goals from the long term to the short term. Don't worry, if I want to go overseas, I'm not going to go overseas. I don't know whether I'll be able to in 2 years' time, but I know I can do it next week, so I'll do it next week. So you give people the opportunity to change the ability to hope for something into the future, but it's a shorter term future. And if things go very well, of course, their life has been made a lot better by achieving a whole lot of small goals that they've thoroughly enjoyed. So it would be paternalistic to give false hope and stop them to have the ability to plan more generously than that. And so despite giving them full information, if they still seem to be unrealistic, it's just a mismatch between the doctor and the patient's version of hope. The other thing that you've got to be careful of, I told the story of the patient who was taking my advice about when to book in his appointment as a source of hope. The other thing is offering a treatment to a patient, even if it's a treatment that's got a small percentage of working, you go through it all and they accept the treatment. But there's always this danger that the patient, because you've offered the treatment, interprets it as that you expect it to work. And that can be difficult as well. So you've got to be very clear about giving people information when you know they're searching for sources of hope. So we've got to know all the sources of hope for a patient. What about concepts like Christian hope? Because the interesting thing is, what is Christian hope, if you like? Well, it comes out of statements that Christ made about things like, I'll be with you always, even to the end of time. So it doesn't matter how rough, tough times get, I'm there, and I'm not going to abandon you. And we're not only talking about this lifetime, we're talking to the end of time. And then there's a hope that beyond this life, there is a life with the Creator that Jesus is pointing away to. So there can be a hope beyond us that people can embrace, that puts our lives into a sort of a perspective of a continuum of a great source of hope beyond. And the interesting thing about Christian hope is it's not just for each individual, it's actually for the whole of creation, so that we're talking about the fact that we expect good to triumph over evil. We expect love to triumph in the end and so on, because that's how we see the universe as it's been interpreted to us through Christ. So Christian hope can be a very powerful source of hope over eternity, if you like. And of course faith comes into that. And faith and hope are cousins to each other, if you like, because if you have a strong faith that something's going to happen, these definitions that we talked about, an expectation, it actually feeds into the expectation that it will happen because you've got a strong faith that it will happen as well. And you've got some evidence in the lives of other people, in the teachings of Christ and the readings of the Bible and the traditions of the church, that these things have affected people's lives in the past. And you see, but irrespective of whether it's a Christian source of hope, everyone is a spiritual being. Everyone that's asked a question, why am I here? What's the meaning of my existence? Everyone that's asked a question in illness, what is the meaning of my life in the context of a terminal illness, is asking a spiritual question, and they're seeking for an answer to the question for several reasons. One is to achieve a peace about where they're at to. They need to find out what the meaning of their life is. The question of the meaning of life is a spiritual question. And spirituality and religiosity are two different things. Religiosity is a subset. Some people find that meaning through religion. Other people find it in other things, in nature, in families, in whatever. But the search for meaning is very important, and it sort of can bolster hope as well. And the search for peace is very important as well. Can I be at peace over the situation I'm in, particularly if I'm still sort of enjoying myself and setting these short-term goals that I can achieve and that I can hope for realistically, and they're meaningful for me. So out of a PhD student's investigation of how we should frame do not resuscitate orders for patients, we had this whole rich field of hope and what it means and how it's sustained. We were able to debunk some ideas about giving and taking away hope, although it was only a noun, because the verb was far stronger anyway, and we were able to look at the fact that the medical hope or lack of it was only one aspect of a patient's whole life that they were bringing into it when they made decisions about what to do next. So that's my sort of introductory bit, if you like, about hope and how it came to. And I'd like to perhaps, open up for some discussion or some questions about that.
And if you'd like to ask a question, please sing it out. I'll come to you with the microphone.
You can ask a question about anything.
Hi, my name is Penny. I'm just wondering, I've often wondered how useful it is for a doctor to actually tell their patient, give them a time frame. You have actually answered that question in part. I had a friend who had brain cancer.
Yep.
He was told when he was first diagnosed that he had 6 months to live, and this was 10 years later.
Yep.
He was still suffering with treatment. The treatment was actually almost having as bad effect on him as maybe the original diagnosis. But I just wonder, are there times when it's maybe not beneficial to give a time frame, or would you like to just
Yeah,
discuss
look,
that a bit more?
It's a very good question. There's a couple of things I'd like to say about that. One is, in terms of the time frame, it's very important to ascertain for the patient what they want to know. And you can actually ask them, in particularly early on when you're talking about things to people, how much information do you want in this package? And sometimes they'll say, look, I've had enough now, we'll have another talk next time. So I would never offer something about a prognosis until the patient, sometimes they directly ask, how long have I got, Doc? And that can be a very difficult question. So the second part of my answer is that it is a very difficult question, in that most people would say that it is far easier to predict a death if it's going to happen sooner rather than later. So the longer you go out, the less accurate you're being. But that's not, in a way, what patients want to know. What they want to know is the ballpark. Are we talking about days to weeks, weeks to months, months to years, or a decade or more? And so you can be relatively accurate within that, and that can be helpful. It doesn't mean that the person can't pin you. You said 2.5 years and it's now 2 years, 7 months. Well, I bet you I didn't say that, but good on you. You're a month more. I hope you enjoyed it, sort of thing. So it's really, so we don't try and give that. And this has got a very practical significance. And in fact, there's a paper that came across my desk. I'm one of the authors of it, so I had to comment on it. We're doing a study with a group of Victorian people studying the advent of voluntary-assisted dying into Victoria, what it means and so on. And one of the questions that the palliative care people asked, which was a very good question, was the rules in Victoria talk about you must be dying within a certain time frame, 6 months, 12 months, whatever you say. And so they said, well, how good are we at doing it? And the palliative care people said we're not. So we looked at all the literature about that and confirmed that it's all very well, for a lawyer to put a time frame on, but how many people are people saying, well, you qualify, and they actually don't? So the answer is, as you get further out, it becomes very more difficult to determine the prognosis. As you get closer to when it's happening, I think if it ever became I think you're going to die within the next couple of days. I think most patients know that anyway, because they just feel increasingly detached from what's happening. But there's a lot of things. There's some really interesting questions, and I've got many anecdotes from my clinical experience about whether patients know that they're going to die and whether they actually ever tell you that. And I think in certain terms they do, and I learnt to pick some of the things that patients were telling me that said, I know I'm going to die. And they did, unexpectedly, if you like, in terms of the time course I would have given them. So it's a very good question, and I don't think we've answered it. And I think if we're going to introduce things like voluntary assisted dying and it's got rules like that, we better make sure that we can actually give a good account of ourselves to see who's eligible.
Maxine, I'm just wondering, in the case of people who, in fact, don't have hope, is there a way to supply it?
Okay, so it's sort of interesting because it comes into the whole question of someone who's dying, someone who's lived a really active life and now they're bedridden, and people say, oh well, nothing like the life they used to live, it's really not worth living. Palliative care counsellors or spiritual counsellors, and in my very early career when I was at Peter Mac, I came across a wonderful woman who was she used to be a radiation therapist, a therapy radiographer, and she do all the technical things, and as she got closer to retirement, she retired from that and became a pastoral counsellor, and she was really good at it. And I think what she used to do is get beside people to really get them to explore what would make the rest of their life valuable, irrespective whether they were bedridden or they could do certain things or whatever. And in the vast majority of cases, there was something that was going to make their life valuable. Whether it be relationships that they'd neglected or had fallen by the wayside that they now had a chance to repair, whether it be after a busy sort of physical life, if you like, finally considering the spiritual for the first time, things like that, that usually there was something that would make their life such that they wanted to continue to live it, despite perhaps some physical discomfort and so on, because they wanted to achieve X, Y, Z. I remember when I was teaching medical students, they used to show us a film of a book, Whose Life Is It Anyway? And it was about a sculptor who had become a paraplegic, and basically the whole thing was about he was trying to convince the medical team that he wanted to die. And these sort of paternalistic doctors were saying, oh no, we can't take you off the ventilator and all the rest of it. And the medical students would get sucked into all this, and by the end of it they were sort of furious advocates for the patient. But in the thing itself, there were a few things that became very clear. He was absolutely passionate about his craft, sculpting. The other thing that was clear, he was absolutely passionate about relationships, particularly with women, because one of the nurses at one stage, before he was on the ventilator, had arranged him to go out, and he absolutely loved it. So what I used to tell the students was, all right, so you go to this guy and you say, in the weekend we're going to bundle you up and take you out to this. And that would give him a reason to live to the weekend. And then someone else would come along and say, look, you're a wonderful sculptor and there's a whole lot of students out there who are just starting. Now, we know you can't do it anymore, but would you mind, before you die, would you mind teaching them? And the students changed their views completely. I mean, we had discovered something that made this guy's life worthwhile. So why would he suddenly want to die? And that's the extent to which everyone should have the opportunity to explore whether there is something that would make their life more valuable. And I think in my experience, and I won't be too specific about it in case someone knows the person, but I only met one person who was a driven businessman, inventor, so on, who, when he was dying, after a long time where he made the absolute most of his life for cancer, and I asked him about all the things, including relationships and all the rest of it, and he'd come up with nothing. It turned out to be helpful because I was actually trying to get him to palliative care from one of the acute hospital wards, you see, and he finally decided that he would go to palliative care, and he got looked after extremely well. But he was the only one that he couldn't think of anything else to do. The interesting thing is I also used to look after his accountant, and this guy would tear his hair out. He was trying to get this fellow out of trouble all the time. The accountant was deeply jaundiced and still trying to figure out how he could let this guy land softly. So people have different reasons for wanting to live, but the exploration of that for people is something that can't be glossed over, even in the most obvious, he's obviously in pain. Now, as you, if you've heard me talk about any of this before, I use a secular example to show where pain isn't such a barrier as people think it is, and I've used it for years, and finally I sort of did it myself and discovered it was true. And that was running the marathon. That when you get to 35 out of 42.195 kilometres, you experience a phenomenon called hitting the wall, which is basically when your muscles have expended all their usual energy sources and basically start sort of breaking down, and it's very painful. So what do people do? They just stop and give up and say, no, I've been through 35k, that's close. No, they push through because they want to achieve one of athletics, big goals, and that's to run a marathon. And when I ran the New York Marathon in 2017, I think, I experienced hitting the wall and just kept on going. I had my son with me, which was helpful, but we decided that, that was what to do. And so there were greater things than this sort of pain and stiffness. And that's the same thing with anything in life. Is there a greater thing? We all focus on the present. Should we focus on other things that we might want to achieve? I should say, because I say this in just about every talk, and I know Michael, you've heard this before from Sunset Rock, but one of the things that people discover when they can no longer do things for people is that their relatives and friends value them for who they are, not for what they did for them and can't no longer do. And that's an incredibly powerful thing to discover, that you're actually valued for who you are. And I used to think it was an enormous shame if you only discovered that when you were dying. So my message is, you are all valued for who you are. Live your life, although that's the case, and it's not, what you do is fine, but it's not the be-all and end-all. So when you stop being able to do, it's not the end of your life, because there are some people that were just happy to have you around. So that's a long answer to a good question.
Hi, I'm Alan. I used to be a clinical psychologist. I'm retired now. I used to work with people with really severe mental illness.
Yes.
I wasn't dealing with people with physical problems. And the most challenging part of my work was people who wanted to die.
Yep.
And had attempted to die.
Yes.
Several times.
Yeah.
And they were the ones that I didn't have much hope for. But I wanted to give them something. And what I used to say to them was, who would miss you? Who would miss you if you were gone? And they'd think, 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 oh, my cat.
Yep.
Or the lady down the street that I used to wave to. Or my mother. And I'd say, think about that and stay alive, because you don't have to die. And sometimes it'd work, and sometimes I'd lose people. It was devastating when that happened. But sometimes people would recover, and that was wonderful.
Look, that's a wonderful example, and if we all lived on desert islands, it wouldn't apply. But we don't. We live in a society with all sorts of other people that we influence. I did some work with Aborigines at one stage in Queensland, and when we'd finished it all, they gave me a painting, and it was a painting with some concentric circles and a whole lot of things going out to the side of it. And on the lines going out to the edge, there were little baubles of different types. And I asked what the painting was, and they said, oh, that's your life. And I said, well, can you explain it to me? Well, the concentric circles actually were really fascinating, because they'd done their homework. They said, oh, there's two circles there because that's your twin brother, and you're intimately related to him. The lines that go out to the edge because you're still alive, which I was very grateful. But the little baubles were some of the things that you do where you know you've made a change in someone's life, and there are other things you have no idea, but you have made a change. So we just wanted to show that when you do stuff, sometimes you know about it and sometimes you don't. So to make people aware that there's a whole lot of people around them that actually appreciate them being there, even if they don't know what it is that they did. Sometimes it's something they said just at the right time or whatever. So that's a very powerful example. And you see, death as a solution to the problems of life is not a particularly great solution, because if the solution is pain, get rid of the pain if you can. If the solution is some sort of distress, work on the distress, see if you can get round it. In philosophical terms, when I was sort of looking into life and death issues, we came across the idea that you couldn't, it was actually articulated, I think, by Philip Devine, who wrote a book called The Ethics of Homicide, and he was saying You can't make, he called it a logical decision, you can't make a reasoned decision to choose death, because to make a reasoned decision you need to know equal about each side of it. We know what life is, we don't know what death is. We know that death, we might have a faith what death is, we might take a gamble that death is better than life, but we don't know that, so how can we possibly choose death to solve our problems in life? And so that was an interesting, just one of the philosophical arguments that comes in to the life and death issues. And it's worth teasing out because it's got a certain simplicity to it that I find quite appealing. Hi.
My name is Jan Finesse. I'm not sure why I'm wanting to tell you this story, but maybe it's good to tell. I need a comment. My son died 3 months ago, and he'd had a struggle all through his life, and he was 49. And one day he said to me, I'm never going to have a quality of life. It's time to go. He wrote it actually because he had an oxygen mask and he's deaf and he couldn't hear and he couldn't speak. So he said, I want to see the doctor at ICU. So the doctor came in and Sam was extremely articulate and calm and measured. And he said, I want 2 days of fun left. I'm going to stop the treatment. And I looked at him and thought, how on earth do we have 2 days of fun? But we did. He saw everyone he wanted to see, and he told us we were all awesome. And the doctor had said to him, we're not losing, but we're not winning either. When actually I think we were losing, and I don't think it was, an honest thing to tell him. But he knew. So he had 2 days, and he asked the specialist, could I just have a bourbon and Coke before I die? So we had 2 amazing days with him. And then the third day, he just was unconscious, and he died in about an hour, which was 2 days of no treatment. But I'm sorry, I'm getting emotional. I thought I could talk about this calmly, but never mind.
Well, thank you for sharing that. That sort of death is one of life's tragedies, and we can only express sympathy when you hear that sort of thing. I do want to make a point from that, though, and that is that withdrawing treatment that isn't having the effect that you want it to have and is a burden is nothing to do with euthanasia. It's withdrawing treatment. We do it all the time. If chemo isn't working, I don't say, oh, I'll have another 3 for luck. No, you don't say that. You say, look, this isn't working. Even if we don't have any more chemo, I've got symptom control drugs and things that I can do. So withdrawing a burdensome treatment that is no longer doing what it was meant to do is not a form of euthanasia. It's actually the balance between, something that's meant to be doing good and something that isn't. So it's a different situation there, and it's a perfectly reasonable thing for somebody to say, look, this treatment is worse than the disease, and I want to not have it anymore, and I want to make the best of the time available. And I think your story about 2 days is a magnificent story, because it's the most memorable 2 days that later on... Exactly. Yeah, and later on that'll be, the focus, well, the whole of his life will be the focus, but that'll be something positive to take out, that he was given the gift of the 2 days. Some people don't get that gift.
You notice that the nurses around him were dealing with him, and, because they heard him say it's time to go, and he looked at them and said, chill out, he said, you can breathe, I can't.
Right. Well, I practiced in America for a little while in Baltimore, and I remember one day removing someone from a ventilator, wondering whether I'd get sued or whatever, but you know, it was the same thing. The ventilator was not going to change the outcome at all, and it was just a burden. The guy had been on it for 46 days or something like that, and it was just outrageous to continue. So, but you know, sometimes within that tragedy there can be the gift of 2 wonderful days. Yes.
I was very interested. My name's Peter. I was very interested when you talked about hope and hoping the concept of the noun to the verb. And it sounds a little bit like a diversion from the inward thinking of the worst scenario and brewing on that to the outward thinking about what are other people around me and the concept of what I can hope to do with them. I just appreciate that very much.
Yeah, look, thanks for that, because you know, the trouble with the noun is it's an external agency is actually giving it and taking it away. You lose the control when that happens, and so if that's all that hope is if it relies on the external agency of good news or bad news or whatever, then you're totally relying on the external world, and yet we all have enormous resources within ourselves, and that wonderful story. I mean, I'm going to give up treatment, but I can hope for 2 good days, is just expresses why that was such an important finding for us. That it's the hope of the person that we're trying to foster, despite what might be good or bad medical things. And of course, as I say, I mean, we rarely actually, when we're giving a prognosis, individualising it to the actual patient, because all the data we have is from, you know, trials of hundreds of patients. So we're just saying, well, in the average case, this is what happens, and you know, you may not be average. And can you hope for a miraculous cure? Well, I didn't necessarily ever see anyone do anything too dramatically more than I would have predicted from the science of the thing, but every so often someone did a lot better than we expected, and who knew why?
Elizabeth Kubler-Ross wrote a very famous book about the 5 identified stages of dying, as she described it: depression, anger, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally acceptance, and admitted that they don't always go in that order, and sometimes you can skip things. But I'm wondering, in your long experience, what you've observed about the different stages of someone's internal processing of the reality, and how those stages might tie into hope.
Yeah, so it's 2 parts of it. The first thing is it's what I was talking about when people are asking the spiritual questions. They're trying to ascertain meaning, and they're trying to ascertain peace, and that's the acceptance phase. I'm finally comfortable that, you know, my role on this earth, despite the fact it's not as long as I wanted it to be or thought, is I've done this and I accept my situation, and I'm at peace with what's going to happen, and I've decided how I'm going to use the rest of my life, and I'm positive about that, and so on. So that's that. I don't want to burst Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's bubble, but most of the patients I saw just plain died. They didn't go through all the stages at all. Surprisingly, even a patient that had been in, 20 times into hospital during the course of cancer with an infection with this and that and the other, they didn't know that the 21st time they weren't going out. In fact, they probably didn't even consider that, because 20 times they'd come in, we'd fixed whatever was wrong, and we'd sent them out again. So those stages are the ideal, and if you have the chance in someone with a chronic illness to watch them work through the stages, particularly work through the initial anger stage, because who are you going to be angry at? Often it was the doctor, and I was quite happy if people were angry at me because it meant they weren't angry at their relatives and they weren't angry at God, and I understood that perhaps later on they'd be able to get through it. It was actually tougher if the patient wasn't angry at you but the relatives were, because the patient when they died left the relatives, and that was always difficult. But that's pragmatic, that's what it's like. So yes, in a chronic illness you might be able to work through these things, but even patients that are close to death don't necessarily know that they're going to die. And so they often just come in one day and the 21st time the infection overwhelms them and they die. And they haven't worked through any of that stuff, at least not sort of overtly in that way. So that was my most common experience of that. I think there's a few interesting cases though where, I talked about it before, where people seem to be able to have some inkling they were going to die. I remember a little old lady we had with us once who came in, and when you did her blood test, every test was all over the shop. And we worked really hard and we got her blood test to almost perfect, you see. So I went into her and I said something like, well, things are a lot better now. And she basically said, oh, I don't think so. And she died that night with perfect blood tests, you see. So a little bit later, I was with a patient and she'd had a long time in hospital, and her daughter had agreed to take her home to look after her, but she needed some time to get some beds and rails and equipment and things. So I went to the patient and I said, look, you're well enough to go home, and before I could get out, but we're going to keep you for a couple of days because your daughter needs to get this equipment. She grabbed my arm and said, you're not going to send me home tonight, are you? And I said, no, we're not. And she kept on repeating this. And she was well. She was well enough to go home. She had a massive hemorrhage and died that night. Now, and what's more, because I'd had that previous experience, I went out and said to the intern, that woman's going to die tonight. She's just told us. And they said, oh, you're mad. Well, I might be, but so I think people, I just have this sense that they have an inkling. And I'll share with you, even my own father, my father had an undiagnosed neurological illness that had plagued him over several months, and even despite two medical sons who put in helpful comments from time to time, we never quite diagnosed what was there, although I think I got closer than the neurologist, but that's an old issue. But anyway, he was in hospital for the last set of tests that could have diagnosed something quite obscure but could have been treatable, you see. And I rang him, I was in Adelaide, I rang him up and I was going to come to see him that weekend. And every time I mentioned the weekend, he didn't answer me. He didn't say that was nice or whatever. And, we went on and talked in the way we usually talk. There was an election actually that weekend and he'd already voted, so he would have been thrilled that he voted and died before, because he used to like that sort of quirky stuff. Anyway, and I mentioned several times, well, I'll be there on Saturday. Didn't say a word. And he actually died that night. And I'm absolutely certain he was trying to tell me, look, because there was one other thing to it. He was on a CPAP mask and he hated it. And he said, do I need to be on that? And I said, is it making you uncomfortable? He said, yes. I said, take it off. And so he was asking for permission to die. Now, I figured all that out later, I guess. But I'm sure that he had an inkling that this was it. And he died that night, and I did go to Melbourne the weekend. So it's the stages of dying. I think Kubler-Ross did a great thing in alerting people to the fact that people don't have to be stuck at the anger stage and so on, and they can work their way through it, and it takes professional expertise to do that. But on the other hand, I don't think it's the whole story, and people don't go through that progression and they just die. And you know, they bring all sorts of other experience into it. Sometimes people bring experience of other people they've known. So they say, oh, this can't happen to me because Joe Bloggs down the street had this, and look, he's, you know, riding motorcycles now. So it's just, it's all sorts of experience people bring into life that you can't allow for.
I'm just Bruce Marriott. I'm interested in the role of personality in terms of hope. We describe personality in many ways, but one way is to say that I'm a person who's a glass half full, he's a person who's a glass half empty.
Yeah.
In hope, that personality will determine to a great degree how each individual responds to information about cancer, for example. Has there been a lot of work done in that sort of thing? Extroversion, introversion versus anxiety, etc.?
People have correlated those sort of types with how you'll respond to things. But I'd make the point that it's probably how you, I mean, it might be how you continue, but it's at least how you initially respond to things. And it doesn't mean that it can't be altered, you know, professionally. So yes, people do have the personality types, and in general, my experience with people who were ill in general was that they didn't change their personality when they got sick. They just expressed it sometimes more strongly than it would have otherwise come out. But the optimistic person was optimistic in the ward. The sort of happy-go-lucky person was always the delight of the nurses in the ward because he was happy-go-lucky in the ward. The sort of chronic depressive person or someone who was always finding fault continued to find fault with everything in the ward as well. And so their personality did play a lot, but I think part of the job, the role of counsellors and psychologists and psychiatrists is to reframe how people deal with their with what challenges them in life. And you know, we've had all sorts of theories over the times and all sorts of therapies that are used. In the old days it was, you know, block it out and get through it. These days it's mindfulness, you know, accept it and embrace it and go on. So it certainly makes an enormous difference how you'll initially respond to it. And it's worth, when you're giving information, factoring that into how you give the information. Yeah.
Giving an example, 21 years ago I was diagnosed with bowel cancer.
Yep.
And I was sent off to the surgeon. The surgeon happened to be a good friend of mine that I'd bushwalked and cross-country skied with for years. And he knew that I wanted all the facts. So he said to me, well, Bruce, with that stage of cancer, there's a 17% chance it's already in the lymph system. There's a 21% chance it's got to the liver. And so he went on, I don't know if they were the actual figures, but he gave me the facts. And of course, me being the glass half empty person, only saw the bad side of it. 21 years later, I'm still here. So.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. And it's like I was saying, some people, if you say, look, you've only got a 10% chance of responding to that, there's a group that are all in the 10%. And there's a group that are in the 90%, and you've got to be more careful in the 10% group that they don't accept the treatment for false sort of expectations. But yes, that's quite right. People do react to things according to their personality, and if it goes well, that's just fantastic. We don't always try not to give figures out of the textbook. I think it's ballpark figures are more useful, and I particularly learnt this when we were doing some work in how to communicate cancer to Aboriginal patients. And you may or may not know that Aboriginal patients have a completely idea of what causes cancer. Your breast cancer is probably because you had a dispute with your aunt, and that's payback. So what's all the chemotherapy, radiotherapy stuff got to do with that? It doesn't make any sense to them. But so when you're talking to Aboriginal patients about cancer, you've got to understand where they're coming from and tell it in a way that they will be able to interpret it. And we've done now a lot of work into that, and we've got some ideas of what sort of illustrations to use. But in my early days, I went up to Darwin because we were about to set up a video conferencing link. This was back in 1995, when it was exciting to do things like video conferencing now. The most famous words in the English language, you're on mute, but we all video conference these days, but in those days it was exciting. I went to Darwin, and the guys there knew I didn't have much experience dealing with Aboriginal patients, so they said, you go and tell that guy over there that he's got, we want to give him some chemotherapy for his liver cancer, and he's got 25% chance of responding. Now, I knew I couldn't go across and say, look, if I give you this drug, you've got 25%. So I said to him, look, 4 men, I treat each one of them, one will get better. And he looked at me and he nodded, and he said, what are their names? He thought I was telling him a story, and I'd already missed out one of the most important things. So, you're quite right. The way people see the world is the way they'll initially see what you tell them. And we've got to be attuned to that. Did you have a question? Right. Sorry.
Do you want to go? No. I'm Ian Penny, you may remember me. I've been fascinated with the various ways people have hope towards the end of their death. And it's fascinating that it isn't always to do with prolonging their life. They want to reach certain milestones within their family and so on. But is there any difference between younger people facing the end of their life and older people that have had most of their life?
Well, there is a difference only because the older people have had all sorts of experiences, and they sort of weigh that up and, I've had a good innings sort of thing, and they're not as angry, I suppose, because they've had a chance to do all the things they want to do. And that's why some of these sort of existential questions, what's the meaning of my life if I'm 20 and I'm about to die, or I'm a teenager? I do some work with Canteen, I'm a teenager and I'm about to die. What's the point of all that? So it is a lot more difficult. Even if they've got a short time, they still value that time as much as the older person does. But it's a lot more difficult for them to understand why they were here. And sometimes it is a matter of who they've influenced, who is going to go on and do things that they may have done but were influenced by them while they were alive. So it's things like that that they can discover. But it's a far more confronting thing dealing with, children, young adults and so on in that area. So I agree with that. It's great to see you again. Ian Penny was headmaster of a junior school when my boys went to Prince's, and I've often told the story because I was trying to show how nice Adelaide was compared to Melbourne and where I'd come from, you see, where they're a little bit more severe. And I forget what it was. I think I did something with cancer on the news one time, and Ian rang me up and said, we like seeing our parents, get out there and do things. And I thought it was just wonderful. So I finally told the story where it matters. Thank you.
I'm John. I'm in remission from cancer of the spine and going well. But before I do that, I might say that I've hit the wall 3 times. And the second time, at the age of 56, I ran through it and did a marathon in 3:50:55, which is still one of the highlights of my life.
Yeah, I was a lot slower than that. I did it twice.
I just thought I'd pass that on. I'm not sure that I can explain in language I would like just what I want to say. My wife might help me with certain words because I'm getting a little bit wayward mentally. I was diagnosed with cancer a couple of years ago, about the start of the pandemic, and given to understand that I was too old to, I was 91 then, too old to really treat with, what was it? Yeah, what treatment? With radiotherapy and chemo. Yeah, and but I was put into hospital that day. I was so bad, and I stayed there for a week while they sort of settled me down, and then I started on the treatment. Well, originally the specialist said that they normally didn't treat someone of my age with the type of cancer that I had. But because of my physical condition and the fact that I wasn't on any medication, whatever, they would give it a go. And they finished up giving me the largest possible dose of chemo, which was pretty small, that my body could tolerate. And I went through the treatment, and I won't describe that because it's not very pleasant, but I had a wonderful time in the hospital. Each visit, I had no fears. Staff and that were fantastic. And I now am in remission. When I was diagnosed, first of all, I thought about, well, this is the sort of end, but I didn't have any fears. And this is what my friend here was asking about, is there a difference between an aged person and a much younger? I often wonder what my reaction would be if I'd been a young 70-year-old or something like that.
Well, that's
because it didn't particularly, at 91, I've had my time over and over again because I have a loving wife of 72 years and a family that's supportive and a lot of friends, and it was made very easy for me. And if I was told that I was going to die within a couple of days, I would have quite happily accepted that. And it can sort of, so I don't have a fear of dying or anything. I've been through that, discussed it with my wife and with my family, and they all know, I'm an organ donor and all the rest of it. But for me, it's been quite easy and not a terrifying thing. But I wonder if I was...
It's a good question, and I'll answer it in a couple of ways. So one of the things is that you don't have to be afraid of death to want to have it early, sort of thing. So, you can be quite comfortable with the idea that you're going to die and you won't take extreme measures to stop that, but that doesn't still mean that you don't want to live and value the rest of your life. So that's what we've said before. Now, in terms of the sort of cancer treatment itself, the fact is that if you can get the same amount of cancer treatment into a 90-year-old as you can get into a 50-year-old, they'll do just as well. So the tumour doesn't care. What limits us sometimes is the other illnesses that a person may have that, which mean the liver won't process the drugs as well. And that's where you've got to make the changes, and that's where you might be reluctant to treat someone. But age is not. I've treated people who are 89, 90. Treated a guy that reckoned he opened the batting with Bradman and he did actually in state cricket or something. But so he was a really interest, but he was fully wanting to be treated, and he was fit and his organ function was good enough. I could give him full doses, and he got rid of his lymphoma as it was in those days, and it was treated well. So I wasn't put off by his age, but we talk about performance level or how fit you are for treatment, and that's the thing that often is an arbiter. And then, of course, if we decide we can treat you, then you've got to decide whether you want to be treated, and people that, even if they're quite comfortable with the idea of death, if they've had a good life and it's still good, then why would you want to cut it short? I mean, I've only been married 44 years, I've got a long way to go. But so I think we try not to discriminate on the basis of age. It's really about whether an aged person can tolerate enough treatment to make it worthwhile to give, and that's how we make the decision for you. The other interesting philosophical argument, just to leave you with that on this question of ageism, people are often sort of saying, oh, you know, if you put all the money into young people, you're disadvantaging the aged, and if you put all the money into aged people, you're disadvantaging the young. The interesting thing is that in philosophical terms, if you were to put most of your health budget into the aged, that would be a form of ageism because everyone's young, but only a few people get to be old. So if you're actually making a resource decision and you wanted to be fair about it, you'd put it into the young, not the old. And people don't sort of see that. Now, it doesn't mean you don't put money into aged care and stuff like that. It's very important to look after people, but let's not get carried away with how fair something is in the allocation of money, because there's far less people that are old, but everyone's young. So if you wanted to equitably distribute your resources, that's how you do it. Just think about it, because it's an interesting thing to think about.
We might have time for one more question if someone has a question.
Really a question, but in my practice I had a relatively young lady dying of breast cancer in her late 40s, and she had 3 children, one who was 18 and at university, and he actually left university to come and nurse his mother at home. She also had a young daughter who was in the mid stages of pregnancy, and the daughter was frantic that mum should live long enough to see this new baby. It would be the first grandchild. The mum had disseminated breast cancer and was in a very, very bad way, and really wanted to die. But there were these competing aspects. The daughter dearly wanting mother to keep going, and the mother really wanting to die because of the discomfort, etc., that we were controlling pretty well, but she couldn't see any hope. Amidst that, I was able to reassure this mum that work was continuing, and in fact, within a couple of weeks, the daughter, in caring for her mother, had come to the realisation that her expectation was unrealistic. And so my point is that not only is the person suffering from the cancer going through a process, but also those intimately connected with them are going through a process. So it was really lovely to see this daughter get to the point where she was able to say to her mother and give her the permission to die because she felt that her expectations were unrealistic. So yeah, there's a whole lot of people tied up in these dying situations. And wonderful, wonderful things happen.
Look,
Thank you.
That's a very good comment. And a doctor's primary responsibility is, of course, to the patient. And most of the time it means the patient and their family and the rest of it. And the most difficult situations are often when the patient and the family don't see eye to eye on something, particularly where the family wants you to do everything and the patient has told you very clearly they don't. And that's where you can get into some point of discomfort. But you've got to defend the patient against that and try as hard as you can to convince the relative that the patient's views are what matter here, and it's not satisfying them that it's about satisfying what the person wants. And so as a doctor you should try, as you did, to reconcile that, but sometimes you can't, and you've got to be an advocate for the patient to do what they want and be satisfied with that, even if you get or sometimes make the relatives unhappy about your decision. Of course, and I won't go into this in any detail, but in other cultures, the family do make the decision. The decision has been given to them. In Greek culture and so on, the eldest son will make the decision about his mother. And it's about their finances, but also about and that can be difficult as well to ascertain what the patient's real decision was. But often they just accept their cultural way of doing things and they're quite happy with that decision. But yes, it's very important that you're treating a whole lot of people, and that people's decisions are not about living on desert islands, they're living in a whole culture. And most of the decisions we make affect a whole lot of people. And I think your story about telling your patients who would miss them and realising that there's a whole bevy of people that would miss them. And I'll just end with one. I went to a wedding. I did some work in Christian Medical College Hospital in Vellore. We set up the oncology unit there, and I got to know the oncologist family. And finally, the daughter that I'd first met at the age of 7 got married in her 20s, and we were invited to the wedding. Had a wonderful time. But I said, well, who do you invite to the wedding? And the answer was, well, everyone that she's had contact with in her daily life. So the guy that sold her the coffee at the front door of the hospital got invited to the wedding, as did, her sister or brother or whatever. So it was this concept that was taken to extreme, and there were hundreds of people at the Indian wedding, but the fact was they looked specifically for anyone that had contact, that this life had influenced, who would value going to that wedding. And it was quite inspiring to see how many people were there and who they thought was valuable in this person's life and to whom this person was valuable. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Ian, for a wonderful talk, and not just a wonderful talk, a wonderful engagement with everyone here, and just the participation tonight and the interest, I think, speaks of the material that you covered and the way that you did it. So just absolutely thrilled at you sharing with us tonight. And please accept this as a small token of our appreciation. Thank you again. And thank you for coming. Don't forget, pick up one of the brochures on the way out, and we'll see you at the next one.